This is an essay about the nitrogen crisis and the farmer protests that erupted in 2019 in the Netherlands, in which I explore the way their visual aspects in the media were used by some to bring the country into a state called the hyperreal, where reality is displaced and polluted by alternative facts, fake news, and disinformation. In 2019, Dutch farmers protested sometimes aggressively against new measures set out by the government to curb nitrogen emissions. Dutch media outlets were flooded with images of farmers on tractors driving en masse on the highway through city streets and crashing through city hall doors. Why were they doing this? To answer this, we have to go back in time a bit. The roots of the Dutch nitrogen crisis can be found at least as far back as the 1960s, when already then, the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture warned against an excess of fertilizer. However, due to the power of the industrial agriculture lobby, governments that tried to address this problem with policy measures would find themselves weakening these measures time and time again. After reaching a peak in the 1990s, nitrogen emissions did start to drop, but leveled off in the early 2000s. Meanwhile, various environmental groups have been suing the government in order to protect nature areas from nitrogen pollution. Although nitrogen is an essential building block for plants, and therefore a necessary part of any ecosystem, too much nitrogen can cause some plants to grow more than others, causing those plants to die off, which leads to chain reactions in the ecosystem as insects and animals lose their food sources. In 2015, the so-called Programma Aanpak Stikstof, aka the PASS program, was implemented by the Dutch government. With this program, the government meant to clarify which nature areas were sensitive to nitrogen deposition, meaning that new economic activities near these areas were only allowed under the condition that nitrogen emissions would be compensated. Then in 2019, various cases against the PASS program, started by environmental groups, were brought to court, which judged that the deposition of nitrogen on protected areas must be ensured, and that it currently wasn't. What this meant was that tens of thousands of projects, mainly construction projects, turned illegal overnight, and the country entered a crisis.
Dit is een crisis van een ongekende omvang.
The government scrambled to find ways to reduce nitrogen emissions, such as lowering the speed limit on highways, and suggesting to buy out or otherwise remove some of the most polluting farms. But things didn't really heat up until September 2019, when it was suggested that the total amount of livestock in the Netherlands should be halved. Farmers had already felt underappreciated in society for years, and this suggestion sent shockwaves through the sector. And on the 1st of October 2019, thousands of farmers got on their tractors in the middle of the night and drove to The Hague in protest, creating chaos on the streets. Since then, protests have continued on and off. Farmer protests in the Netherlands aren't exactly new though. What makes these protests different, I think, can be explained by looking at their visual aspects and the relationship between postmodernism and post-truth. Although the actual effects of the protests remain debatable, it is clear to anyone that the farmer protest movement used powerful visuals to gather together farmers and to galvanize the public support for the cause. In particular, 3 images I think are important to look at in detail. To begin with, the image of the farmer on the tractor covered in picket signs, driving on the highway and through city streets. It's an unusual look for a tractor and an unusual place for a tractor to be. Then there is the image of Dutch flags turned upside down, and finally slogans such as "No farmers, no food" and "Trots op de boer," which means proud of the farmer, which became commonplace. According to an article by Tom Gunning, professor of film and media at the University of Chicago, in which he discusses the truth claims of analog versus digital photography, the American philosopher Charles Peirce conceived of 3 categories of signs: the icon, the symbol, and the index. Gunning argues that neither analog nor digital photographic, and by extension videographic images, are necessarily examples of an index. That is to say that while they seem to provide evidence for the existence of the images that they're showing, this truth claim is in fact debatable. In other words, no photograph or video can show an objective neutral reality. With regards to the farmer protests, I would say the explicit image of a farmer on a tractor adorned with picket signs, subjectively, might exude power. And specifically, it is an image of power of marginalized, hard-working rural people who are standing up against the establishment, which fits in with the narrative behind the farmer protests and the goals they were trying to achieve. such as the need to be taken seriously by society. Furthermore, when we see images of multiple tractors driving over the highway in a convoy, I think it portrays strength in numbers. Indeed, I think if the farmers had traveled to protest at the Malieveld in The Hague by train or even by car, there may have been just as many people, but the image would have been a lot less powerful. Tractors tend to be very large vehicles with a lot of power, and particularly in the city, people do not often encounter such formidable machines. The Dutch flag is a symbol for the Netherlands. It's clear that the colors of the flag have meanings which bear no resemblance to what they signify. The meaning of the flag has to be culturally learned. The Dutch flag represents the country and the people. Although there may be an official definition for what a Dutch person is, I argue that in practice any national identity is vague and again subjective and expresses itself in a wild variety of ways. This variety, I think, is particularly clear between people living in urban areas versus people living in rural areas. Interestingly, national identity seems to be more narrowly defined and of import to people in rural areas. The significance, therefore, of upturning the Dutch flag to represent that the people were not being listened to, I think sent a powerful message, particularly to rural populations. Finally, words, and therefore slogans, are also symbols. The slogan, "No farmers, no food," is a simple slogan which implies the fundamental importance of agriculture to human civilization, and it is very difficult for people to argue against, considering virtually all people today live off of the food produced by farms. However, I think there is an aspect of deception inherent in this slogan and its implications, because the majority of food produced in the Netherlands is produced for export and profit. And meanwhile, a large proportion of food consumed in the Netherlands is imported, and therefore has little to do with the system of agriculture in this country. Postmodernism developed in the second half of the 20th century as a response to modernism, discarding the belief in grand narratives and the idea of an objective truth. The French postmodernist Jean Baudrillard claimed that our current era is marked by simulations, in what he calls the third order of the simulacrum. In this state, the boundaries between what is real and what is simulated have collapsed, and it becomes impossible to tell which is which. Individuals begin to feel lost in an infinite circulation of information through media. Very quickly, the way in which information is shared through digital communication technologies may become flooded with disinformation, misinformation, and fake news. In an article by political scientist Yael Brahms, she claims that postmodernist theories themselves may be partially responsible for the growth of disinformation in the 21st century.
Even if the postmodern approach does not reject facts and reality and does not completely abandon objective factual truth, it does lay the foundation for casting doubt on the objectivity and absoluteness of truth, and legitimizes the populistic, pseudo-postmodernist discourse of the anything goes and this is my truth variety. Nevertheless, it is important to keep in mind that this substandard discourse does not derive from an in-depth understanding of postmodernist ideas, but rather derives from a distortion and reduction of them.
During the nitrogen crisis, people were bombarded with media images of tractors, upside-down flags, and simplistic slogans. And it is not unimportant to note that the 2019 farmer protests were financially supported by big agricultural corporations, in particular to fund a communication agency to develop a clear message and help develop an organized and effective protest movement. There were also various ways in which critics of government policies for nitrogen reduction went further to reject scientific evidence, and even to replace it with alternative facts. For example, in 2020, the Mestdagfonds cast doubt on the official nitrogen emission measurements that the RIVM had come out with, and which were fundamental for the initial court cases that led to the crisis. Within weeks, however, these were proven to be inaccurate, and the Mestdagfonds quietly retracted their numbers. Nevertheless, this contributed to enforcing already present feelings of resentment and mistrust of the status quo, that is, of the government and by extension, the RIVM. At the most absurd end of a spectrum of critiques were suggestions that the government made up the nitrogen crisis in order to steal farms to then build housing for immigrants. In this 2022 interview between the American far-right political commentator Tucker Carlson and the Dutch Eva Vlaardingerbroek on Fox News, Vlaardingerbroek also takes the image of hard-working rural people and marries it with xenophobic notions and even communism.
What exactly is this about, and what do you think that it means? Well, very simple, Tucker. What this is about is the Dutch government stealing our farmers' land. And they're doing this under the guise of a made-up nitrogen crisis. And that is basically going to put most of these farmers completely out of business. And thankfully, the Dutch farmers aren't having it. So they're going out on the streets, they're blocking distribution centers, they've blocked the high roads, they are fighting back. And they're right to do so. This is their life's work. They're really at their wits' end. They're devastated by what the government is doing. And, well, it's very clear that the government is not doing this because of a nitrogen crisis. They're doing this because they want these farmers' land and they want it to house new immigrants. They also want it because the farmers are obviously standing in their way of the great reset plans that they have for us. So, yeah, farmers are hardworking, God-fearing, and especially self-sufficient people that are just standing in the way of their globalist agenda. And it's driving a lot of these farmers even to something like suicide. So really, there's only one term that we can use for the things that our government under Premier Mark Rutte is doing right now, and that is communism.
A recent explorative study by criminologists Jessica Hill and Marleen Weulen-Kranenbarg, they analyzed the disinformation surrounding the nitrogen crisis and made comparisons to the movement of science denialism surrounding climate change. Translated from Dutch, they say, the three core arguments used in climate science denialism, the science is incorrect, the damages are exaggerated, and the solutions are damaging and threaten Western society, are all present in the nitrogen crisis. In 2023, the Farmers' Protest Party, BBB, won an overwhelming victory in all provinces of the national regional elections. Caroline van der Plas, founder and leader of the party, herself contributed to casting doubt on nitrogen emission measurements.
Voorzitter, we hebben geen stikstofprobleem. We hebben een stikstofwetprobleem. Doe daar wat aan. En laten we gewoon helemaal kappen met al die modellen. Modellen die niet actueel zijn, mogelijk fouten bevatten en modellen die vaak niet uitkomen. Omdat werken met gemiddelden nooit een beeld geeft van de realiteit.
Yet today, her party is one of 4 of the ruling cabinet. I can't say that this victory can be attributed to post-truth surrounding the nitrogen crisis, but I also cannot say that it can't. I do think that it is possible, however, that the constant repetition of images of angry farmers and the spread of doubts and disinformation has contributed to parts of the population being unable to separate truth from fiction, and this may have affected their voting choices. If this is true, post-truth has ended up determining actual policy decisions. In other words, the hyperreal has preceded and then affected reality. In the world of ecology, degraded ecosystems such as industrially farmed grasslands are sometimes called green deserts due to their lack of biodiversity and often relatively poor nutrient conditions. In a state of post-truth, fueled by powerful corporate interests, it seems we are stuck in what Baudrillard named the hyperreal, a desert-like place where reality is empty and meaningless. As a result, it seems the Netherlands may have become the green desert of the real.
What is reality? Obviously, no one can say because it isn't words. It isn't material. That's just an idea. It isn't spiritual. That's also an idea.